Lately I've been playing through the Metal Gear Solid games, and it's been making me reminisce on my time with the series. This is a legendary game series with 7 mainline entries, and a variety of spin-offs starring Snake & Co. But there's one cancelled game that keeps coming to my mind while I'm currently making my way through MGS2, and that's Metal Gear Solid Rising. If you're out of the loop, you might be surprised by that statement. After all, Rising did release, right? Well, sort of. You see, a version of Rising did eventually come to fruition developed by Platinum Games, but the original concept for the game was so vastly different than what we inevitably got that I ironically feel sort of a phantom pain for the Metal Gear Solid game we never got. I do really like Rising, and it holds a special place in my heart as the first Metal Gear game I ever played, but I can't help but want for the original concept as an MGS fan, as Metal Gear Solid Rising would have covered a gap in the series' timeline that really needs to be explored, and would have been more in line with what we expect from a Metal Gear Solid entry than what Revengeance ultimately turned the concept into. Metal Gear Solid Rising started development at Kojima Productions at an undisclosed date prior to its announcement in 2009, with the key figures behind the game being Metal Gear veterans who wanted to make a game starring Raiden. Kojima himself took on a producer role, rather than his usual director's seat, as he personally wanted to pursue other projects. Kojima had been trying to step away from the Metal Gear series since Metal Gear Solid 2, and this seemed like a good enough opportunity to set up the next generation of Metal Gear with new blood who were under his direct influence without him helming the project himself. The key figures on the project were Minishi Kimura, who took on the director role for the title, and had a long history of being a lead artist on the series since Metal Gear Solid 1 in 1998. Etsu Tamari, who was a writer for Peace Walker and 5, served as lead writer, and legendary artist Yoji Shinkawa served as the lead character and concept artist. It was also decided early on in the project that the engine that would be used would be the Fox engine, a proprietary engine developed by Kojima Productions for use in Metal Gear Solid 5 and the Ender project, which was another cancelled project. With the team assembled, the game was announced at Microsoft's E3 2009 conference with a title reveal, and then fully re-revealed a year later with a full trailer at E3 2010. The press conference showed off a cinematic trailer that showed off the tone, some gameplay hints, and a couple basic story details presented by Hideo Kojima himself. The trailer also showed off some brief seconds of gameplay towards the end that showed exactly what we could expect from the project. This gameplay itself was different from what we got with previous Solid titles, with it being focused on utilizing Raiden's high-frequency blade. The gameplay philosophy was based on the concept of Zandatsu, which means cut and take in English. This philosophy led them to many different gameplay ideas coming through here. The first you'll notice in the cinematic is Raiden cutting through an enemy unit known as a Mastiff, and pulling out his intestinal battery and crushing it to gain power. Cut and take, right? They also had the idea of utilizing Fox Engine to its fullest extent to allow players to cut anything in one slice. You heard right. The initial idea was to have players be able to cut anything they want at any time. Cars, robots, bridges, cyborgs, watermelons. Everything could be cut. The initial promise was an interesting selling point. Games just simply aren't made like this, as it's practically a programming nightmare. Not only would it take a lot of work, you'd also have to be able to trust your physics engine not to crash if the player cuts too much. You have to remember this game was planned to release on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Nonetheless, it was an interesting concept, though I'm doubtful that everything could be cut in one slice, and even in the conceptual phase, as bosses were planned out, and I have a hard time believing they were susceptible to being cut once and dying. Regardless of my comments on the feasibility of the system, I think this brief look at gameplay looks pretty phenomenal. The engine looks fantastic, and I could definitely see how the Zandatsu concept could work gameplay-wise in an interesting way. This is just me speculating and fantasizing here, but I could totally see how this game would work combat-wise. This is just me speculating and fantasizing here, but I could totally see how it works. Its initial concept being seemingly unchallenging, enemies could do moderate amounts of damage to Raiden and be in high numbers, leading to challenge coming from you having to improvise and take out enemies in quick succession before they can kill you. This is sort of supported by the gameplay we do see, as enemy density does seem to be relatively high for the time the game was coming out, and we see Raiden cut down a structure to take out 2 enemies shooting at him. I imagine stealth would have been really fun as well. I can't find it anywhere in my research, but the generally reliable Hyperbit Heroes video, Metal Gear Solid Rising and Revengeance, Lost in Concept, states that the game would have had an interesting approach to stealth, comparing the ideas the team had to a hunter and prey-like system, where Raiden would stalk enemies and be comparatively more like a hunter than his previous special ops stealth tactics in MGS2. Again, fantasizing here, but I could really see how fun this could be, as arenas could be designed with Mastiffs and other high damage dealing cyborg enemies, leading players to having to stalk their enemies and rush to take them out before they get taken out. Since both Raiden and his enemies would die in one hit in these encounters, it would lead to some really memorable and fun stealth encounters where you're on the edge of your seat for the entire encounter. The story of the game also seemed really interesting at this point, and it covers a crucial gap in the Metal Gear timeline that still isn't filled to this day. As much as Big Boss's transition from hero into villain was something that needed explaining after Metal Gear Solid 3, Raiden's turn from human to cyborg was something that needed even more explaining. Add on top of that the fact that 5 to 10 years pass in between Metal Gear Solid 2 and 4, and plot developments like Raiden rescuing Sonny from the Patriots, a major event that deserves a game, is completely unexplored. And well, you have an opportunity to make a really interesting game in this gap. Raiden's full transformation into a cyborg would have been covered in this game, with the game tackling why he did it and give an explanation for the character continuing to be a soldier and giving up his organic body post-MGS2. The main plot also would have been about Sonny's rescue, and looking at the concept art for the title, the game would have seemingly tackled themes of parenthood. There's some really eerie concept art of a cyborg enemy holding a cybernetic baby. The game was also planned to have a darker tone, potentially being more in line with Metal Gear Solid 5 than previous entries. Now, after all this, you're probably thinking, the game sounds great, what happened? In the years that followed the initial reveal, it was relatively quiet on Konami and Kojima Productions' end, with the biggest news about the game coming from a website launch and a TGS 2010 tech demo that showed off the Zandatsu system, with Raiden cutting watermelons, showing off the physics tech. All would be silent for a year until it was announced that the game would be skipping TGS 2011, as the team was hard at work on the game. Behind the scenes, the game wasn't doing so well. The team lacked clear direction, as it was Kimura's first directing role in game production, and issues arose during development. Kojima took a more active role in production of the game during this time, and shifted around staff to try and get the project out the door. Unfortunately, not seeing progress on the project the way that Kojima wanted, he decided in 2011 to cancel this version of the game and hand the project over to Platinum, who would make the game we all know today. According to a report by IGN reporter Mitch Dyer, indecision was the biggest problem facing the developers of the game. They were all younger developers who haven't been given this much freedom to create before, and without Kojima's direct involvement as director of the project, they floundered. At least that's the official story. And while I'm sure that the game did suffer from having people unfamiliar with these new roles struggling to know what to do, it's also extremely obvious from reading up on the game that there was a split in how exactly they should approach the game. The Kojima Productions team described the game very differently than what Kojima seemingly wanted from the project. Kojima would say that he believed Rising should be stupid and thoughtless fun, and that Rising would play more traditionally dissimilar in North American action games, and that it wouldn't really matter if the game didn't have a message like previous Metal Gear entries he was behind. Those comments directly contradict the comments made by the team and the details I shared above. By all indications, the game the team wanted to make was very different than the one that Kojima wanted. The darker tone, the story covering complex themes of parenthood and rebirth, comments by Etsu Tamari saying that he loved the script for the game, and it would have had the best bosses in the franchise, not to mention the mechanical complexity apparent in the concepts for the game. The combat and stealth of this game did not seem to be as stupid and thoughtless as Kojima seemed to have wanted. This might seem like I'm painting Kojima out to be the villain here, but that's not my intention, as I think he was right to want a different product from the team. The team was inexperienced, and essentially what they were trying to do was make a main Metal Gear Solid game with a completely new and complex combat and stealth system with a controversial story. That's great that they wanted to make that, and I'll forever wish things worked out well for them, but they were punching above their belt level. The team would have been better suited for a more simple game that didn't force them to work with such a difficult development process. Add on top of all of this that this would have been the first big Metal Gear Solid game without Kojima directing, and people would have been expecting equal level quality to the previous 4 games. And it's no wonder that Kojima ultimately decided to move the project elsewhere. Some of the gameplay and story concepts from Solid Rising did make it into Revengeance, but by all intents and purposes, Revengeance was a completely new game. Instead of taking place between 2 and 4, the game is the latest in the Metal Gear timeline, and takes place after 4, picking up where that game left off. As such, the story tackles a very different period of time in Raiden's life. Some gameplay concepts remain, such as a more simple version of the Zandatsu system, where you can still cut enemies in any way and take their energy for yourself. But you can't kill enemies in one hit, and cut everything in the environment. You can still cut down a lot of structures in the environment, but it's not as extensive as the original concept. Stealth is also there. It's not the original concept, but it's in the game. I might sound a little negative on Revengeance, but to be honest, I really do like the game. It's honestly fantastic. It's just very different from the original concept I fell in love with. It's only a disappointing game when comparing it to the original version, But taken on its own merits, it's a great experience with fantastic combat, and a ridiculous but also timely and fun story. Revengeance is great, it's just not Metal Gear Solid Rising. Recently, Konami has made efforts to resurrect the Metal Gear series with the release of Metal Gear Solid Master Collection Volume 1, and the announcement of Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater. They also have placed Noriaki Okamura, director of Zone of the Enders, and his team in charge of the future of the series, with the stated goal right now being to preserve Metal Gear for future generations. However, inevitably, we will see another Metal Gear title beyond just remasters and remakes. And while that's as scary as it is exciting due to Konami's recent track record, I have a little hope, as a lot of Kojima Productions veterans still work at Konami 13 years later. I'm positive they probably have the experience to make a new game, and not repeat the mistakes that were made with Solid Rising. I can only hope that it's good without the tutelage of Hideo Kojima.